So it's been 3 years since the fall of the Afghan capital, Kabul, to Taliban forces. In those 3 years, we've seen a really series of developments in the region, in Afghanistan, and of course, in India's policy towards the Taliban and towards Afghanistan. Joining me now is one of India's top experts on West Asia, Kabir Taneja, who is at the Observer Research Foundation. Kabir, can you start by telling us a little bit about the fact that, look, it's been 3 years since Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. Could you tell us a little bit about how the country has evolved under Taliban rule in the last 3 years?
Thanks, Shashank. Look, I think evolved is a very strong term. They've just managed to keep power in play for 3 years, basically. And I think initially, that was their agenda. Their agenda was to make sure that initial first year specifically, when it is the most volatile, considering they've been out of power for so long, that they survive, whether it's through force or whether it's through consultations with other partners and parties. So they have survived for 3 years, but that is also because the world has been distracted by multiple other things. Even regionally, I think there is no appetite for taking Taliban in any shape or form. It's very interesting to note that despite everything, even regionally, although most countries are dealing with them in some shape or form, whether it's trade or people-to-people ties and so on and so forth, very few have actually recognized the Taliban officially. I think the Chinese have, but also, they've taken the ambassador on board officially, but they've not said that it's an official recognition on paper yet. Mm-hmm. If you see the Russians, the other large party, trying to be more influential in Kabul, they have repeatedly said that, yes, we will deal with the Taliban, but until they form an inclusive government, we will not recognize them. So everyone's, taken a step forward and a step back over the 3 years. It's strategic ambiguity at play for the region. And for the time being, I think the Taliban are not too bothered about that. They're consolidating their own strengths amongst themselves. There are differences between Kabul and Kandahar as well. As we know, Kandahar has come up on top in these 3 years. You hardly hear about people like Mullah Baradar, as you're showing on your clips right now. It is more about what the Supreme Leader Akhundzada wants and wants to be done in the country according to Sharia diktats, and that is what is happening at this point of time.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit more about the domestic developments in the country? Of course, we've seen a tremendous backsliding in terms of women's rights. There have been questions about how stable this arrangement will be, given that there are tensions between various factions of the Taliban itself. Could I ask you a little bit about that? What is the domestic situation right now in terms of the domestic politics of the country?
Look, there are tensions, definitely, tensions between the Supreme Leader and the Haqqani network and a lot of these guys who were part of the negotiation teams in Doha. There is also a lot of mistrust between Kandahar faction, which has always been in Afghanistan and in Helmand, then Kandahar. They are not the ones that travel to Doha or Qatar or UAE or European states for these talks. The ones that have done so are in positions of power in Kabul, but there is immense amount of mistrust between these parties. But I think they have also recognized this mistrust and also come to this conclusion that maintenance of power at this point of time is more critical than sorting out their internal divisions publicly. In the first year, we saw that there were even some skirmishes between power centers, armed skirmishes between power centers. Those have stopped. So there is, it can be argued that there is a more stronger cohesion, at least workable cohesion for the moment that they have put in place just to make sure at this point of time that there is stability, security stability, specifically as tensions between the Taliban and the Pakistanis are growing.
Right. And could I ask you a little bit about, the humanitarian situation on the ground with people, we have talked about major economic crises, food exports that have had to go from countries like India, given widespread starvation and hunger. Could you tell us a little bit about what the humanitarian situation is like on the ground? What is the evolution?
Yeah, look, the humanitarian aid, I think, is being provided by the international community, largely the Western countries right now. Now, how is that aid being utilized or where it is going? It's difficult to say. But look, there is a big gap in information in Afghanistan right now, right? We only get to hear what the Taliban wants us to hear, and we only get to hear what the Kabul wants us to see. So what is happening in the provinces beyond the point, I think it's anyone's guess, right? But if you see the indices, whether it's on health, whether it's on nutrition, and all these kind of things, I think Afghanistan is at the rock bottom right now. So there's clearly a huge gap between what is being told and what is happening. And I don't see one if the government structure or the interim government structure is busy just consolidating power right now, the deeper requirements of the citizenry always comes second. That's the rule of the game, unfortunately. So and the international pressures that were pushing the Taliban till last year or till some months ago on a lot of these issues have gone quiet. And that's again largely because interests have shifted. People have also gotten, I think in the West, there is no interest in dealing with Afghanistan beyond a point. If you try to even raise it with them as an issue, usually you find a very sort of nonchalant approach to it. For the region, countries like India or Central Asia and all that, everyone is just managing the situation right now because almost everyone has a bigger fish to fry than going back to, let's say, the old 90s where the Taliban was confronted using various other factions and support of various other factions like Ahmad Shah Massoud and so on.
Understood. And I could ask you a little bit now, a segue into how India's policy has evolved. India set up a technical mission to engage with the Taliban. The Taliban has seemed open to engaging with India as well. Can I ask you, how has New Delhi's calculation of its interests changed over the last 3 years? How have you seen the evolution of India's diplomatic engagement with the Taliban?
I mean, that's a good question. Look, India's policies have shifted a lot in accordance to the shifts that are taking place within Afghanistan. First and foremost, I think India is just at this point of time happy that it has some presence in Kabul. And it is also presumably happy that the relationship between the Taliban and the Pakistanis is going completely south.
Right.
Because that was largely the strategic interest that India had, that, okay, fine, that the Pakistanis thought that they have strategic depth within Afghanistan, which turned out to be not true. We saw the former ISI chief yesterday who led talks on the Pakistani side in 2021 after the fall, being imprisoned now. So it's very odd that the Taliban is still in power 3 years later, and the person who was supposedly brokering everything is going to prison. So beyond these sort of very niche strategic dynamics, I think it's great that India has restarted some issuing of visas. There was an absolute and critical need of giving some relief to students, giving some relief to people who are seeking medical aid in India. And of course, just people-to-people ties when it comes to trade and so on. There are direct flights between Delhi and Kabul. So on that front, I think we have covered a lot of distance over the past 3 years. There has been clearly some confidence-building measures between the Taliban and New Delhi as well, so as to allow these kind of decisions to take place now. Now,
right.
Of course, just very quickly, India has one foot in the door in Afghanistan, but also one foot out. So it's not a space where you are thinking very long term. You're thinking short term, and you're acting short term.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about this question of India's security interests, which is that, of course, one of the key interests that India has in sort of engaging the Taliban is also ensuring that there are no security threats to India at large. Do you think that India is more comfortable that the Taliban understands India's security concerns and will not therefore pose an active threat to Indian security?
No, India's security concerns with the Taliban are no different to the security concerns raised by other countries, including China and Russia.
Right.
Now, the problem here is that the Taliban's understanding of addressing these security concerns is basically saying, okay, fine, we are going to manage these groups. They're not talking about dismantling these groups. They're not talking about eradicating these groups. They're not talking about sending these groups somewhere outside Afghanistan, and they don't want to be hosts for these groups, right? All they are saying is that they will make sure that Afghan territory will not be used for terror attacks against other states, which is becoming difficult. We've seen ISKP gain significant ground in parts of Afghanistan. We have seen them attack Russia. We have seen pro-ISKP attacks in Europe and so on and so forth. So how long can this last is a big question mark still. So the security concerns have not been diminished in any shape or form, and they have not been addressed in any shape or form. The Taliban is just managing the situation right now. If you see most UN reports also, they say that Al-Qaeda is still very much present in Afghanistan. Now, how long does this last? Are there conflict of interest between the Taliban and these groups being told to keep quiet? And how long will they keep quiet? These are open-ended questions right now.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about that Pakistan dynamic that you were alluding to? Could you just lay out, for our viewers, how things have changed over the last 3 years? There have been lots of tensions about, the Pakistani wing of the Taliban. Pakistan has had issues there, and the relationship, as you were mentioning, has really gone south. Could you just explain very basically from start to finish what exactly went wrong there?
For the Pakistanis, the main issue is the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is the Pakistani Taliban, which ideologically is against the power center in Islamabad, but also the power centers in Rawalpindi. Now, for a long period of time, the TTP has fought for the Afghan Taliban as well. So that really significantly pushes back Afghan Taliban from doing anything which impedes on the TTP's territory and TTP's interests. So what they've done now is that the Afghan Taliban says that TTP does not actually exist in Afghanistan, as they say about ISKP as well, and that it's a Pakistani security issue, and hence Pakistan needs to address it within its own territories. Even yesterday, the Taliban released statements basically saying that if the Pakistani military comes into their territory or their airspace, they will react militarily as well. So tensions are fairly there, and they're fairly robust in nature. How this gets sorted out, the Pakistanis have tried both diplomacy and going through the theological, ideological way by sending in preachers and mobilizing the ummah, so to speak. But nothing has given till now. So it's a precarious situation for the Pakistani as well, and the threat of a spillover between that dynamic is not much, but it can bog down the Pakistanis a fair bit on that part of their borders.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit? I'll return to the question of Pakistan. Could I ask you a little bit about what we saw in India just a little while back with the closure of the Afghan embassy? Then there were questions about how India was dealing with the remnants of the previous regime. There was some criticism from the former ambassador of Afghanistan to New Delhi, to talking about how the Indian Foreign Ministry had essentially not allowed the embassy to function properly. Could you comment a little bit on this particular question of how New Delhi handled the remnants of the last regime, the closure of the Afghan embassy here, and just lay out what a little bit of the controversy was for our viewers?
Look, the Afghan embassy was a very simple issue. As you know, the Afghan embassy is still largely under the auspice of the former government, former Afghan government, so-called the Republic of Afghanistan, which is technically not there anymore. But since India does not recognize the Taliban and has no plans to recognize the Taliban, that means the mission as well cannot be given to an entity that represents the Taliban. Now, the problem here is that within all this, India still needs to deal with the Taliban. Right, and the Taliban, of course, wants this embassy as part of their diplomatic mission, while the other party would not let it go. That was the crux of the issue. That beyond a point, India had to step in a little bit because it was impeding its outreach to Kabul right now. And whether we like it or not, that outreach is important. It's necessary. From various points of views, whether it's, let's say, the evacuation of Sikhs, as we saw, some of them got citizenship recently as part of the CAA, or our national security interests as well. It's considering, you have to remember that our technical mission is still active in Kabul. So for all this very precarious ecosystem to work, you need to balance all these intra Afghanistan issues. And that was largely what the embassy issue was. It had very little to do with India, but we have seen this embassy issue crop up in various other countries as well. It's not just an India issue. It's a symptom of what has taken place over the past 3 years.
Right. Could I ask you to also comment on another controversy that had come up, which is about the issuance of visas? Lots of students, a lot of Afghan citizens wanted visas to come to India. Those were not issued. That became a point of controversy. Could you just explain what happened? You, of course, also mentioned that some visas are now starting to be issued. Could you just explain to our viewers what exactly happened, why it was so controversial, and what has changed now?
Well, the visas were suspended the argument was on security issues, that if they open up the visa system, that they don't know who's going to apply, they don't know who might get accepted also, and what those actors' interests are going to be once they are here. Which was very sort of, I mean, it was a thin, standing on thin ice issue. I don't think it was that big a concern, because unfortunately what has happened is that a lot of public goodwill that India built over the past many years in Afghanistan, especially amongst the youth, has got fairly dented, because we were not giving out visas to students. We were not letting students resume their studies at Indian institutions, and so on and so forth. From what I know, I think that has been addressed till a certain extent now, not completely, but till a certain extent. And hopefully that all the damage done over the past 3 years of not having a more realistic and robust visa system for the Afghans, considering we had this for the past 20 years and we shut it down out based on the security concerns, did cause a lot of damage. So it's good to hear now that some of that is being addressed. It's 3 years or 2 years too late at least, but hopefully it arrests some of the bad faith that the Indian government had gained amongst Afghan youth specifically.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about, the political situation on the ground in terms of, you were mentioning under the CAA, some Afghan Sikh got citizenship. Of course, in some parts of India's neighborhood, especially Bangladesh, when we did the CAA, it sort of gave the impression that India was saying that our neighboring countries can't handle their own minority problems. This was seen as a form of criticism. In fact, Prime Minister Modi went to Bangladesh. There were protests on the streets. Has this impacted, how has this been seen in Afghanistan? Has it caused any problems at all, or is this really just a non-issue?
Not really. Look, it's very interesting question to see, because I think every neighboring country has its own different dynamics of how this plays out with the CAA and sort of India's interest of relocating minorities to safety. The Taliban has repeatedly said that first, that the attacks against the Sikhs in Afghanistan was done by the Islamic State and not the Taliban. Second, that they are willing to return damaged properties of the Sikhs, including temples, back to the Sikh community. And based on that, they would like to welcome the Sikh community back into Kabul. So it's a weird sort of pluralistic position that the Taliban is taking. Now, the problem for the Taliban is that I don't think that view is universally accepted within the Taliban itself. And this is where we come back to the differences between the Kandahar faction and the Kabul faction, which has traveled more, has seen the world more, or probably has dealt with other countries more, where they know what compromises can be made, and they know what gains can be made out of compromises, and that necessarily does not is a view not shared with the very hardliner mullahs within the Taliban, and that's where we see a different, and that's also why we've seen a little bit more activity on the CAA front and the relocation front when it comes to minorities in Afghanistan. But also remember, the minorities in Afghanistan are fairly small in numbers compared to, let's say, Bangladesh or some of our other neighbors. So addressing that issue, both logistically and politically, is less of a problem than, let's say, doing it wholesomely with Bangladesh or one of the other neighboring states.
Right. Now, if I could just ask you some, future-facing questions in terms of what happens now moving forward, if I may ask you to indulge in a little bit of speculation. In terms of, what happens domestically, let me just ask first a very quick question on the domestic politics. Do you think that, you were referring to divisions between the Kandahar clique, as it were, as well and other factions of the Taliban? How do you see these tensions evolving in the future? Do you think that it will damage the cohesiveness of the governing elite of Afghanistan? Can we see perhaps more instability and conflict in the region, or do you feel like your sense is that they will manage to keep this at a manageable limit, this division within the Taliban?
I think there are two fronts to that question. The first is, of course, domestic, right? And I think right now the Taliban is the Taliban would be fine in stamping down its own population as far as it can maintain power. And I don't think it would. We have seen in the past 1 year specifically that ideologically it would not compromise to gain concessions from the West, whether it's money, whether it's aid, or whatever it is. I mean, look, we are not even talking about the girls' school issue anymore. It's completely off. because even the Western parties have realized that that was probably the single biggest stumbling block between reaching out to the Taliban. And right now, even in the West, all they want to do is to make sure that it does not spiral out of control to the point where a kind of military intervention. Now, second is, of course, you have to also remember that Afghanistan right now is a part of a big power competition. The Chinese and the Russians would do anything in support of the Taliban just to make sure that the American military infrastructure does not return to Afghanistan, but neither to Pakistan. They need this region to be free of American and Western political and military weight for the future, so that it will be largely sort of, if not satellite to the Chinese and Russian interests. Pakistan is already a satellite, but at least influential enough that it does not fall into an American or Western bracket. So there are multiple clinks to this of how it's going to work. So, but crystal ball gazing is a dangerous game. So I'll not go too far into predicting. Afghanistan is a historically very unpredictable place, so it's difficult to say.
Right. And if I could ask you in terms of the Indian position and how India moves forward, could I ask you to sort of lay out what you think the Indian policy would be moving forward? Of course, there's different elements to it. There's participating in international format dialogues on Afghanistan, engaging with Central Asian countries, engaging with Russia. Also, of course, conversations with the Taliban itself, with our technical mission, humanitarian aid. Do you think that the policy that we've seen over the last 3 years is largely likely to remain the same, where India is essentially looking to manage this problem as much as it can, characterized by a little bit of like a short-term vision of where it wants to see things go?
Okay, I got some of the question because it was dropping out. But look, there is a reason why India is more keen on working with, let's say, Russia on Afghanistan, because there is much more concern in Moscow, and has been so for the past 2 years, on what happens in this part of the world, specifically with their interests in Central Asia, than raising the issue of Afghanistan in, let's say, Paris or London or even DC and so on and so forth. So, there are systems, let's say, within the SCO, for example, there is an Afghanistan contact group, which is fairly docile right now, and largely because of, there is enough conflicting interests within the SCO as well. But that these smaller sort of parts still remain, as far as multilateralism or even unilateralism is concerned on Afghanistan, your best bets, because there are no other bets. We saw what happened in the Qatar UN conference also. It was a complete shambles, and it ultimately provided nothing. So for a country like India, the best options right now is, of course, to directly deal first with the Taliban. It's the need of the hour, which we are doing anyway. But as far as a global sort of view is concerned, India will have to see. Realistically, right now, it works best through Moscow and the Moscow format. At least that is where the Taliban is forced by the Russians to often attend. The Russians also invite the Taliban ideologues to their places like Kazan, which is the Muslim majority part of Russia. So they are doing much more capacity building with them, so that future pressure points can be built on the Taliban in 4 years or 3 years if they're still there in 4 and 3 years.
Right.
So I don't have too much faith on any other larger platforms and formats right now, not because of the formats themselves, but because there is a larger lack of interest on Afghanistan right now.
Understood. Kabir Taneja, thank you so much for joining us and laying out what has happened in Afghanistan over the last 3 years, laying out some of the internal tensions between the various factions of the Taliban, how their international policy as well as their domestic policy has evolved, what India's diplomatic stakes are, some of the tensions that the Taliban has had with Pakistan, as well as the stakes of other international players, especially Moscow and especially Beijing. Thank you again, Kabir, for joining us, and thank you so much for watching India Today Global on this 3rd anniversary of the fall of Afghanistan, of the fall of Kabul to the Taliban.